So this is sort of the part two of our conversation about non-degree credential quality. This part is going to focus more on data and what are the appropriate data sources for measuring non-degree credential quality? What are the pros and cons of those data sources? What are different approaches to measuring quality? So this is a hybrid panel. Stu Andreessen is with Burning Glass Institute. When formerly with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, when he went back in over the years with the NCRN, but he's been with BGI now for a couple of years. I'll be awkwardly like looking back on the screen since he's right behind us. um, and now with Burning Glass Institute, Executive Director of Programs, I think is your title there. And we also have live with us in the room, Jeff Stroll from Georgetown University, Center for Education and the Workforce, Isabel Cardenas-Navia with WorkCred. So I think we'll start by letting each of the speakers take us a couple words about what they're doing and kind of what's the phrase? The horse in this race, dog in this race. Thank you. And then we'll have a few questions kind of guide the discussion, and we'll definitely, if at any point members of the audience want to jump in with a question, feel free to raise your hand. Mike in the back has a microphone. He will run and hand that to you. It is important that everyone speaks into the microphone for this particular session, since that's the only way that Stu can hear. Yeah.
Why don't we start with our overlord, Stu, if you like it, brother.
All right. Overlord's one version of it. I thought maybe larger than life, but whichever we want to go with. So just a quick introduction to myself, and I know that you guys have heard a little bit about some of the things that BGI has been working on already this morning. But Stu Andreessen, I help lead our program team at the Burning Glass Institute, and Burning Glass is largely a data experimentation lab. We were founded a couple of years ago by the person that built the company that's now called Lightcast. Innovators in use of real-time labor market data and innovative kind of constructions of large data. Now, the institute really came together because a lot of people, myself included, started to say, hey, there's a lot of data floating out in the world that's not being organized and structured in the way that is instructive to answering the types of questions that people in this room have been wrestling with for a long time. How do we understand the quality signals and the pieces that help us understand where we should place investments to make an economy that helps connect people to meaningful work, that gives people chances to move up, and connects them with the education that they need to do that. Now, at the end of the day, there's a couple of things that come into my mind as we think about that. Now, is data itself going to be the solution to the problems that we were hearing about on the last panel? Are we going to actually connect people to meaningful work and things that are going to both put them in the place that they want to be to succeed, that allow them to be satisfied? Data alone is not going to do it. I don't want to short circuit the rest of the hour, but our strong belief is that data can help inform those conversations. But at the end of the day, it's an information piece. Now, are there things that we can do much differently and potentially much better with new data? I think so. But if data alone were the solution, there's been a proliferation of new data available. The first time that I started using any type of real-time labor market data was over a decade ago. It's much more available, it's much more understandable, much more usable, but we would have seen more progress on creating economic opportunity if that were the only thing. Now, non-degree credentials have also changed really, really significantly in the last 10 years. The number of people that are providing them, the types of venues that they're coming in has really just exploded. We know this from the work that the Credential Engine has been doing. My boss is often one to say that there are now more credentials than there are words in the English language, which is something to think about, right? So what do we do with that? I actually think we need to think about how we build data systems that are kind of built into the regular um, day-to-day kitchen table conversations that people have about how their lives are going. And I would put that out as a challenge for all of us in this field where we're doing a lot of deep research about things. How do we take that research and make it usable to people? It's some of the things that we believe that the Equals project in particular, but kind of the things that large data sets can do for non-degree credentials is help to elevate and kind of create some type of just general semblance of understanding of what a non-degree credential will do for you, what it may not. And there are certainly parts, and I'm hoping that we'll get into conversations about kind of the differences of approaches in measuring non-degree credential quality that we can get from kind of both big data sides to much more kind of provider, institution, or even learner specific analyses. But we think that there's a lot that you can get when you start to structure and use this data to say, hey, here's, you start to be able to get in the realm of answering questions of what type of field should I pursue? What type of institutions, what type of providers, organizations, companies are offering these things, and how do I compare one versus another? Can I get anywhere near an apples to apples comparison? Can I at least decide whether I want an apple or an orange? These are the types of questions that I think that we can start to get towards with some of that larger data analysis. I will also say that I just think that there's a lot that can happen when we start to put together what feel like very different structures of measuring quality. And I hope that we can also spend a little bit of time talking about what would we get out of that. In an ideal world, I think that we have ways where people understand credential quality the same way that people talk about their kids going to college, and they have kind of a really visceral understanding. I think that I will also say something that may feel a little controversial, but a lot of what we have about and understand about credential or college selectivity and the things that we get out of that are often kind of really well baked in, and we need to work towards a world where people can understand that and kind of have a general understanding. And I hope that that's where we can start to go.
Hi, Isabel Cardenas Navia. Hello? Hello? All right, thank you. Great. Isabel Cardenas Navia. I'm the Associate Executive Director for Research at WorkCred. And I'm going to start off by talking about sort of WorkCred, our mission. So our mission is really to strengthen workforce quality by improving the credentialing system. And so we really look at the quality, value, and effectiveness of credentials. And so I'm really coming at this from that work cred perspective, right? How do we, and we focus on non-degree credentials, and we have a particular focus on non-degree credentials outside of the higher education system. So the majority of the non-degree credentials currently held right now are folks outside the higher education system. So so this is not right we don't even know the names of these credentials. We don't know how many issuers they are. We can't even capture sort of who is in the system. And so this is a very different animal, right, than the higher education system, where we know how many higher education institutions there are. We generally have a sense, at least for many on the credit side, we know that the non-credit side is a little crazier, right, with its counting credentials. But it really is a challenge to sort of get our heads around sort of who is in that system. But at WorkCred, we really think about this, right? How do we begin to get that data in? What impact would it make on the credentialing system if we had that data? And how would it be used then to improve the quality and effectiveness of the system? And so I'll respectfully disagree with Stuart that the goal is, at least I don't disagree. I agree with nearly everything he said. I think what I'll say is when I think about where we are in our data systems and sort of what is possible in, say, the next 10 years, I actually think we should prioritize getting data to inform uh, credential issuers, policymakers, because it, I think that is a more sort of realistic goal. And I'll just give you an example. So if I, as a I have 3 young children, I see a rash on one of my kids, right? I Google it. Google has all the information in the world on all the different rashes. It has pictures. It has a ton of information on there. And I will go in, I can take a picture and try to search for it, right? In the end, I have to go to my pediatrician because my real question is not like, it is, what does my child have and how do I help my child? That is not the point where we're going to be able to have for non-degree credentials in the short term. And so I would argue that, when we think about the data and the data system, particularly when we're thinking about folks outside of the higher education system and capturing that, a more sort of, and as we see that policymakers are making decisions, right, about non-degree credentials, that capturing that data to inform what is going on there is really a priority. And then the other thing I'll say is, when we think about what those credentials will be used for, and by policymakers, by credential issuers, right? As we think about data outcomes, and if we think about capturing, I think a lot of what we're talking about today is sort of wage and employment outcomes, occupational outcomes, but certainly there were a lot of other factors talked about in the earlier panel, and I think that Stuart mentioned as well, right? But how is that data going to be used by credential issuers? And so we would love to see continuous quality. This is not just a judgment, right? It's not just for a ranking system. It's not just to get wages, which we can't actually impact by credential outcomes, right? It's, will they improve their credential? Do we think this data is actually going to be used to eliminate some credentials? Like what data is actually going to be useful to credential issuers to improve the quality and efficacy of their credentials? And I will say it's not just wage and outcomes data, right? And so I think we have to think very broadly about what is the goal and the purpose of this data we are seeking. And I think one other thing, if you think about too, if you think about the wage and outcomes data, which is again sort of a lot, and understand why we're getting it right. That's very important for policymakers and for individuals too. But if you think about sort of outcomes data for highly selective higher education institutions, it's going to be good. Is that actually a reflection of the credential and education they have received? Or is it just a reflection of the population they're serving? And I think that there is a piece here that is where assessments need to be a core part of what you're talking about when you're thinking about credential quality. If you want to actually judge whether or not the credential, the learning, the knowledge, whatever it is actually going to accomplishing what it's going to accomplish. And I'll say along with that piece, when you think about transparency, right? We really need to think about standards for these credentials. And so I'll just mention WorkCred's affiliate of the American National Standards Institute. We believe in standards as a way to improve the quality and effectiveness of many kinds of systems, not just the credentialing system. So I'll give you an example of how standards can really impact how a system works. So the first electrical code and standard was passed in 1897. It's updated every 3 years. It's now an American National Standard. It is not required. 50 states can choose, as it's updated every 2 years, to adopt it or not to adopt it, right? So this is a voluntary approach where we have a national definition. You can go buy something on Amazon, buy something at Target, buy something anywhere, buy something at a garage sale. You can know and plug it into your wall and know that it works, right? It is interchangeable. It is mobile. You don't have to worry when you move from one state to another, one house to another, whether or not your electrical things are going to work. In 1970, if you live in a really old house, you may not have many 3-pronged outlets because the third prong was made part of the American National Standard in 1970. These standards do change and they're up to date and they allow mobility. It's a very chaotic system, right? If you don't have that for your electrical outlets. That is not that different than how the higher education system is. There is standardization. Everyone understands what a degree means. That's part of the reason it has labor market value. That's part of the reason you can compare degree programs and you have all those rankings, right, for these programs. When you think about quality, if you don't understand that you're actually comparing apples to apples, or you don't even know how to judge an apple that is different than an orange, then it's going to be very hard to make quality judgments or send a message about quality out to anyone. And so I would suggest that as we think about data, there are these other pieces that are really important to go along with, which is, what is it being used for? Who do we actually want to impact when we think about the data that's available? And then actually, how do we make it useful? So I'll stop there, but
Thank you very much. I'm Jeff Stroll. I'm the new director of the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce. Our longtime director recently retired, so I'm the new guy. So before I get started, I had a conversation with Roy Swift before this meeting, and I promised to invoke him. I actually threatened to tell Minnie a joke. And I cannot imagine a meeting like this without Roy just getting ready to ask me a bunch of very pointed questions. So please,
It's really quiet today.
yeah, I know, exactly. I mean, and so I promised him it'd be like a roast without a chicken. So anybody who wants to tell Roy Swift jokes, he said he bring them on. So anyways, the Center on the Education and the Workforce came to be to focus on the intersection of education and labor market research. And as we move forward, we continue to try to push the envelope on how do we think of these issues of value? How do we think about education as an instrument that helps and enables people to become socially mobile? A part of this effort with non-degree credentials, I've been part with some in the room. Andy Reamer is one who goes back pretty far on this to about 2009, trying to really figure out what the heck this non-degree credential space is. And I would say then we didn't know what we didn't know. And we've really evolved because now we know what we don't know. And it's a hell of a lot. So following up on what Stu was saying about data isn't really the answer. We have to remember that almost all of our data, including the quote unquote real-time data, are all very lagged. There has a lot of noise in those data. And we have to really come back and trust ourselves. And I like to say the smell test is more important than the t-test. So as we see these elements and try to understand them as being valuable, we have to kind of ask ourselves, what do we mean? So in the earlier panel, there was a lot of discussions about program quality. We don't have any measurements of program quality. I mean, what are we talking about? We're talking about reputation effects. You cannot tell me that program X and HVAC in one community college is better or worse than another. So we're stuck with a whole bunch of very imperfect metrics, commonly earnings, to try to have an understanding of does it have value or not? Because we know that the majority of the students, as much as educators want to talk about all the non-pecuniary benefits of education, people are looking for a job. And so we fall down on earnings, but a lot of the work that we've been doing as of late has really been trying to investigate the other parts of the dynamics of that create positive earnings that cannot be actually attributed to the education program itself. And I think this becomes an extremely important part of the conversation. If we look back to the last regulatory implementation of gainful employment that whacked predatory practices, we saw some for-profits close and then move to high-wage labor markets so they get to game the system, because our data in both the scorecard and in gainful employment is not geographically controlled for differences in price of living. So a wage in New York City is not a wage in rural Kentucky, but from those programmatic values of quote unquote quality, one looks good, one looks bad, and so we got a problem. But so what do we do as we move forward? So what the center tries to work on is this: don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We have some information that we can use to help us understand whether or not programs are in fact valuable. And then we need to put that value concept into context of the localized economy, the historic trends, how they affect groups differently. And so that's how we try to engage this conversation. So as we look into this world of certificates and certifications, going back to the last panel, one thing I want to just kind of throw out into our thinking as we think about how we measure quality is certifications are one of the items that we actually test for. We have an exit exam, where certificates, we do not have an exit exam, we have reputation effects. And if we look forward, or actually look at some history, employers are hesitant to apply an employment test because, going back to Supreme Court case of Duke Power, that you cannot use an employment test to accurately predict performance. So we're stuck in a world where higher education has gotten away with not having exit exams. The employer is not very able to use an employment test because of legalistic issues. And now we're stuck with earnings. And earnings are a great measure to help people understand what the last generation, the last cohort did in that job, and we hope that the past predicts the future, right? And so we have to work from that. So, but what can we do better? How can we actually take this messaging to people to think about value, to give them good information? So think about the student. I've got an 18-year-old just about to enter college. And what's he going to look at? The current period earnings on a certain program, and he's going to graduate 4 to 6 years later, and the earnings in the market are going to be different. How do we start to use these limited instruments that we have to hone the imperfect measures of value that we have, and message them correctly? And the people have talked, about career counseling, et cetera. How do we bring that information into that process? Be critical about the data I'm giving you. And so anyways, I'll leave it there.
So one of the overarching questions that I wanted to see if we could explore in this panel is, where are we now versus where would we like to go in the next few years? And I think I'd actually like Stu to respond first, since obviously ecosystem is making major investments right now. How, where the research methodology is going with equals. So I guess it's a two-part question. One, maybe we could have a few updates on, when will we be able to go on to equos.org? Am I on? Yeah. Oh, okay. So, as a two-part question, I guess I think Stu can answer first, would be one, when can we go on to equos.org and look up our favorite credential and see, what the quality metric, see a judgment of quality there, or an assessment of quality. And the second part is, for each of the panelists, let's say that we had some resources, say a funder was ready to put in, I don't know, $5 million over a couple of years, that, what we think of as in the range of a typical foundation investment. What are the most critical things we could do to improve the quality that could feed in, quality of data that could be fed into assessment of, and improve the data, the quality of the data that could be go into an assessment of the quality of credentials?
You're up, Stu.
Yeah. So let me start just by picking up on a couple of things that that Isabel said, and I think that we're really, really aligned. I don't know enough about the electrical standards, but I honestly spent the last couple of months talking with a few people about mapping standards. So if you can think back at the early days of the highway, pre-interstate highway system, there were not common numbering. So you'd come to a highway intersection, if you bought one map, if you bought Rand McNally's map, they would staple signs on poles that said, you're on Highway 78, you're on Highway 66. But at that same intersection, you would see a different mapping system. Now, there was a fight to be the standard there. I think that some of the challenges, like in an ideal world, we're able to start to align around what those standards are. There are people that are going to benefit by one standard versus another. I'm sure that the electrical companies that chose the four-prong or the European style in America ended up losers in 1879 or 1970. All of the times that we've had those changes. So we want to think about what those standards are, but also in a world where we're not near a standard. There's similar kind of histories of the keyboard that we all use. It's not technically the most economically efficient keyboard. It is the one that we use. So it's it's the standard. It's become the standard, but there's technically a different array of letters that would better fit the English alphabet than exists. So those standards we want to think about, like how do we start to imbue the values that we want in a world that get us where we are, that are going to push that, because they're going to be ending up being standards that are kind of driven by regulatory decisions. So the McNally numbering ended up winning. They were able to effectively convince Congress that that was the one to go with, and led to, at least for a time before GPS, huge wins for them in the map publishing business. And the thing that I worry about with as we think about all of these, right, is that there are different things that people want you to see and hear. And I worry about people that are trying to navigate the labor market, and they're not necessarily getting the information about what a standard is. So we know that there's huge variation. If we go back to our higher ed parallel example, there's huge variation depending on the type of degree that you get in even just earnings. And let's simplify the conversation to earnings. But people would generally say a college degree is worth it. Now, there's obviously kind of growing skepticism about that, but generally, and all, most analyses show that there's positive returns to a college degree. We can get much more granular and understand that. We want to do both, but we want to figure out what those standards are. So I think that we're quite aligned. And I hope that we can get into what are the things that should be in a framework beyond earnings and employment outcomes. We think that there are things that you can start to impute, like what does someone learn? When they get a certain credential, what type of job does it actually align to? These are things that are not always readily available. Now, to the broader question, I will say that I'm going to push off a little bit on the when can we go on equos.org and look up your favorite credential, because there's a couple things that are on that, in that discussion. First off, it won't be until we feel really, really confident that that the information, like that we're going through data kind of expansion, robustness, all of that. And so we want it to be right. But the other thing I think that we want to figure out is the use case right? There are certainly visions of that specifically as feeling like something like the U.S. News and World Report, like this is the number 1 and this is the number 50. That's not always necessarily the way that's best used. But like, how do you think about student, learner, worker centric program improvement? I do think that there are some things that help build markets around it. So, as we've tested this, we see big variation among providers for the same credentials. I'll use an example where we saw that was a community credit union in Virginia that had started to lend for CDL programming. Now, they found that there were much better outcomes with certain programs because they were much more closely tied with employers. They had union partnerships, and they connected people to high quality employment. The same provider in the same community didn't do that, and their graduates didn't have the same outcomes. They all ended up employed. They all ended up employed in a field aligned with the credential that they were earning, which was a CDL. But there were ones that they were willing to kind of back and provide lending for. Those are, I think, instructive and helpful things for people to see. And I think it also is a different use case to start to help to scale programs like that. So if we can think about how we drive resources towards effective programs, which is fundamentally there, I think there's market mechanisms where you do it. And I think there are policy mechanisms where you do it. I agree also that the general kind of first interventions are going to be in the policy field. Like, I don't know that, getting back to is data the solution to everything? We have to think about how people navigate the labor market and we navigate their educational choices. And I'm not sure that it's always, the world's filled with tools that have been consumer first, and we want to make sure that we're getting in the right space for that too. So I actually think that we imagine versions of ways of taking the EQUOS framework and integrating it into policy related discussions that help get there. So we're getting ready to look at a number of pilots around that.
When I think about what your question of what I'd like to see sustain or commitment to, I mean, I would like to see a commitment to building some sort of data on who holds non-degree credentials, maybe not who, but not, yes, that's sort of like similar to the clearinghouse, but for non-degree credentials outside of higher education. I think that you can't actually begin to impact the broad workforce system if you don't know. And I'll give an example. If you look at the manufacturing sector, if you look at restaurant and hospitality sectors, these are not the highly credentialed population, worker population. They are huge part of our economy. If you don't talk about the non-degree credentials outside of higher education, you are not talking about a very large segment of the workers in the United States. Because you have to be able to think about how do we start to capture that data. And actually, I'll just say, and I think we need a funder with a or funders who have a sustained long-term commitment, talking 10, 20, 30 years to develop this kind of data. And I'll say that because at the last NCRN, I believe Michelle talked about state longitudinal data systems, and it took decades to build them. Decades of sustained commitment from states. And you are going to need a similar sustained commitment if you really want to tackle the data issue on non-degree credentials outside of higher education. I'll stop there.
Go quote, click on that, right? All right. The, the single biggest piece of information for evaluating the quality and outcomes of programs is occupation. We have a UI wage record data system built in the 1930s on industry, and it gives us no information to evaluate programs on education and training placement. We need it. There's movement going on it. And if funders get before it and help these states move this, Nebraska is the latest state to have done this and is doing a really good job on bringing occupation in. It's a critically missing piece of information that the entire community should get behind, because it really does enable us to do things like stop waving our hands at career pathways, stop waving our hands at career ladders, because you need to know occupation to understand if somebody is utilizing the supposed skills they got from a program, because occupation is what you do. You don't do industry. Industry is where you go to work, and this is a problem. The second thing that I would suggest that we start thinking about, and to put it in the funder's ear to address your question, is as we talk about non-degree credentials to highly stereotype, we're talking about specific education, where our education system is built around both general and specific education. And by focusing only on non-degree credentials, we're really saying we're only focusing on technical education, which we're focusing on the historic route of tracking, while a whole bunch of other people go and get general education as about 50% of their education. And we're not focusing on it here. And we're missing a really critical element of how these two pieces interact. There's a lot of really good work that's done that shows that overinvestment in technical education holds the economy back from its production possibilities frontier, because of it lowers our ability to adapt to and adopt new technology. So here, as we talk about non-degree credentials, we need to think about how they interact. And if you look at the data on certificates and certifications, people don't hold them as standalone items. They are being held by everybody across the education spectrum. In particular, there'd be a number of individuals in U.S. economy. Chasing shadows with a flashlight. When we sign oh, I need to talk into the microphone. Sorry. I usually don't have that problem. And this idea of chasing shadows with the flashlight, when we take a flashlight on an issue, we're pushing a whole bunch of other things into the shadows, and we're missing the nuance. So our focus on non-degree credentials is missing that it nests within a very important and particularly U.S. context, because we're one of the few places that really builds on the combination of general and specific skills. And here, all we're doing is focus on specific skills. We need to widen that. And it's a very difficult research agenda, because the general skills are less tangible than the specific. And that is a pretty difficult research agenda. So anyways.
So I have another couple questions, but I thought I would take a moment to see if anybody on the floor wants to ask a question of our panelists, because I don't want anybody at the very end to feel like they're standing in the way of lunch. Uh, yes.
Gonna stand because it's hard to sit too long. I would just say I'm not sure. I sort of agree, but I don't sort of agree because I think going forward, we're seeing some states and places where they're going to offer a badge or a micro credential for the gen ed core. They don't have to have an associate degree, but there's this important learning that's developed. So I think the line is already blurring, and that the research that we've come up with that people don't have a standalone or whatever, I actually think that's going away, and that we're going to see more and more micro credentials or combinations of some new, whatever they're called, and that we're going to have to look at that. And so that's my concern, is I don't think the way it was is how it's going to be. And that I'm hearing some people in the employment world saying certain careers and jobs, they're going away, and the conversations is moving to tasks and skills. So maybe we're even going to stop talking about careers. I mean, I don't know what we're going to talk about, 5 or 10 years from now, but I'm sort of thinking maybe that is going to be the new conversation. We're just going to hire for skills. We don't even know if degrees. And the other thing is, I love the term incremental credentials, because I feel like they should be recognizing learning along the way. Degrees are part of incremental credentials. Right? I don't love the term non-anything, but I feel like you're talking about a way of meaningful learning units, credentials, getting degrees. If we were just using another term, we wouldn't have to say, well, this non-degree is not fair, degree for that. So I'm just saying, I'm just going to raise more questions, but I'm not sure I agree, but I don't have it well formulated.
Well, I mean, the point that I'm making is the history that we have. If you look at a certificate or a certification today, it's on average most commonly going to be a very specific form of education with the general education component stripped out of it. I am suggesting that an overinvestment in that specific education, as we've done historically, is a bad social investment, and there's a bunch of really good research. Coomer and Kruger is one that I'd point to, that suggests that overinvestment, it might look good today while the employers scream about having skills gap problems that are solved by specific skills, that we're making a mistake by overinvesting in just the skill, because the general education in many ways is what imbues the U.S. economy with its flexibility and its inherent ability, more than many other economies around the world, to react to change without having to have a Trade Adjustment Assistance Act to take the dislocated worker back. The general education, in fact, gives the ability to react to change. So you might be correct. Moving forward, we'll come up with a new form of short-term learning that balances technical and specific education. But in addressing Kyle's question about what is the next thing that is worth looking at, is how do we actually get to what you're suggesting it'll evolve towards, is the complementarity of general and specific education in a way different than we do it now. And the way we do it now is people with the BA get the combination, and people with the certificate just get specific education. And that is directly correlated with inequities and tracking in our system historically. So that very nature of the dual system is at least correlated with a hell of a lot of social problems that I like to see us not have again. And I know so would you, so many people in the room. So anyways.
No other reactions, maybe Lou?
I have a fairly simple question. We all agree that we have much better data than we had, say, 40 years ago. My question is to you guys, how has having that data changed the actual performance of the choices of the students and the performance of the providers?
Okay, I'm going to jump right on that one. We haven't done very good because we've underinvested in counseling. And there's a great paper on occupational funneling that shows that without having good information, that people come into college with a wide body of interest, talk to their roommate and a whole bunch of people, and end up everybody doing business consulting. So we need to have a bigger investment in informational literacy. I couldn't go to these websites, especially if I was 17, and make much use of them. So
I'll agree that I think that there, from the big increase in data we have, it is not translated necessarily to better information for individuals. And I'll just point to, and it's really interesting, I think that there is a distinction here too between, I think people understand, we did a manufacturing study, partnership with Kyle, and we looked at frontline manufacturing workers and we asked them all about their credentials, what they use them for, what their value was. And we asked them as well, sort of two questions is, do you know what skills you want to get next? And 100% they knew. They listed the skills that they felt were going to advance their career. And then we also asked all of them, do you know which credential you want to get next? And 100% did not know what credential they wanted to get next. And so there is a huge, skills and credentials do not, I mean, we know this, but it really does not translate to individuals who are seeking this information. So I think that that's just something that we need to get, hopefully then, 10 years from now, that'll have a better answer.
I'll put in my 2 cents on that one too. I think that there's in several NCRN meetings, I keep saying that we need to think about, that how students' use of information is changing. Where are they getting their information from? I definitely think social media has grown as a source of career information. And I don't think any researcher or research center, somebody in the NCRN should take a look at that and understand to what extent. Because I look over my wife's shoulder at her Instagram feed. It's constantly, ads for the day in the life of a nurse, sponsored by ITT Tech or some, career college, filling the program. Obviously, even if students had access, even if we have the great information systems, if the states are not going to invest in career advising at the local level, if we're still going to have 1,000 to 1 career counselor to student ratios in high school, if we're not going to make that investment nationally, we'll still struggle to use even the latest.
I have a couple reactions to this, and I think that there is, I agree with Kyle's assessment. We need more information on how people have consumed labor market data. We need to understand how people are understanding that choice. There is some work that that looks at how people react to labor market data as provided to them by counselors. Turns out that people generally think that they're going to be on the upper end of wage distributions. Even, so this is a study a friend of mine did where he was just at a workforce board, then delivering people labor market data. They say, I want to be a barber. And he would ask them, what do you think you're going to get paid? They'd say $85,000 a year. He said, the average is like 32 or 24. And so what do you think you're going to make now? Would hand them the data from the Occupational Outlook handbook. And they would say, oh yeah, I'm probably not going to make 85. I'll make 80. People see themselves in certain ways, and we want to think about that too. That's not necessarily that we're going to get people to react kind of widely differently, but I think it's really important that we think about how we have people interact with data. And this is like some of my big questions. Like, are we thinking about all of the ways that people get data? So I think that we often can assume that it's going to happen in a counseling setting. When I would commute to work, I would see those ads too. I would see it come to barber school with an ad where a guy's sitting in a Bentley, literally holding a fist of cash. And there's not only information that people are getting on the labor market, but there's also misinformation that people are getting on the labor market. And those really matter. I think it's really, really important that we think about the use of that. One thing that I've always wanted is in the way that the ACA started having calorie counts on fast food chains. I would love to have wage counts on education and training advertisements, just so people could understand hey, this is an ad that shows a great career in hotel cleaning. The average outcome for this worker is this. That type of information, some states have passed those regulations, but think about how we make that public data public. It's usually on a website that requires someone to go and log into a spreadsheet and look at it, not be completely understanding what they're seeing. And we need to think about how we take public data and make it publicly usable, which is a different task.
I think you know, I think this is, but I think the challenge of this, right? Challenge of translating the data into useful information and educating an individual on how to consume that information is a really large one. And I think that's why I would argue that we would prioritize information informing policymakers and credentialing issuers. And go back to the example. So in my previous career, I was a cancer researcher. And you can give an individual all the facts in the world about what the survival rates are when they have died. But what they really want to know is, how am I going to do? And not the most informed doctor in the world cannot actually tell them how they're going to do because it is very individual. And people, right, it's good that they assume the best, right? If you have cancer, it's very good that you assume the best. But it's not necessarily, this is not trying to tackle this is much more complex than just having really good data.
A little humor here. I have an 18-year-old just about to go to college, so you can imagine the amount of information that the poor boy has been swamped with from dear old dad here. And at the end of the day, him and all of his colleagues are applying to the same schools, didn't listen to a damn thing that I had to say, didn't look at any of the data that I had to look, and all my wisdom is, gone to waste. But the thing it makes me think of, we ought to do, someone needs to do a, sort of a cognitive field test to figure out the informational interest of the students, because it's going to be a limiting factor to how well they can use the data. So if the point from credentialing is right, there's a million programs, 4,400, 4,700 institutions, it's very difficult to assemble that information. So what is the salient information that we should be giving the students? What would they react to? And it'd be really nice to have better answers, which I don't think we do at this point.
And just one last kind of thought on this, and I'll try to be really quick, is that let's think of it as a marketplace rather than a system. We always talk about education systems, we talk about workforce and training systems, but people are competing, and many of our policies actually push decision making to the individual. You get an individualized training account, you have a Pell Grant, you take a student loan. Those are individual choices in a marketplace, and those individual choices are very valuable to both elite education institutions as well as for-profit, nonprofit training providers that are competing for that individual choice. Now, we could reconceive policy that changes that, but to me, I also want us to think about how we prepare people to navigate a marketplace rather than a system.
Michelle, what are we? Go ahead. Yeah.
All right. So I appreciate but I'm curious, one of you mentioned the Texas Technical Education System. It's the only system that I'm aware of that does performance-based funding. So they're the only system I'm aware of that actually takes the data we're talking about here and uses it to defund programs that aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing in terms of improving the outcomes for students, and vice versa. They will fund programs that are highly effective. But they're a unique case, but I'm hoping that our group can do more to get other states to do what Texas does. I'm sorry to say Texas is a paragon, but it isn't this particular case.
I just wanted to inject one thought into this conversation about a marketplace and the presumptions of how a marketplace works. I think there's a lot of assumptions that marketplaces work very rationally and people are looking at all the information and reasonably evaluating it. And I will say that on this question of decision making and how learners navigate these choices, our team has done some research. Actually, Eliza Peterson, who's here with me today, has been the lead on that, where we've learned that students look at information differently at different points in their trajectories. Sometimes they can be very rational and try and collect all information and make good decisions. Sometimes it's just very relational and trust based and like based on what friends see or based on what hobbies they like. Or so I think we have to just be flexible in thinking about how we use information and how we think about using it to guide choices, whether it's individuals making rational choices or maybe influencing systems to help shape information in a way or shape choices for students better. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there, but just a thought about the sort of presumption around decision making and how we put out information.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that and to respond to Stu, yes, we should think about it as a marketplace, but it is not a marketplace like the stock market and the way it uses information. There's a lag between decision making and outcome, going back to Richard Freeman's stuff on am I not talking about you? Sorry. There's an information lag in the market where you've got public institutions. It's just not a free market. So just to be careful about how we use treating it like a market and identify the characteristics that define it as a market.
So I'll jump in with another question kind of about data and how what I'm wondering right now is, how will we know when we have enough data to start making more meaningful judgments about quality? It's mentioned the previous panel that Equos is looking at 20 million data points, has cleaned up data records on 4 million individuals. What would we be looking at, in terms of if we wanted to have how will we know when we have enough data to move to the next step in terms of moving actual quality frameworks to actual outcome, an actual output that could potentially be used either guide policy decisions or guide students and educational institutions and actually guide real world decisions on credential choice?
I'll just come up with one is a very tough question. If you can identify that you have enough information to make change.
I'll agree with that. I'll add that I think that information is going to be different for different credentials because it's credentials, right? You've gone to a work cred presentation, you've seen our chart on different kinds of credentials, and different credentials exist because they serve different purposes and they measure different things. And so there is not going and credentials are evolving, right? And so it's really hard to say, okay, when we have this, it will be enough.
I think those are the right answers. I think Jeff's initial thought of like, is this information giving us the smell test, passing the smell test? And you test that in small places, and if it starts to feel really good, then you think about like, hey, let's expand this statewide. Let's expand this to a region or try a national policy around something. But I think we start small, test it, see the depth of change that can make.
We'll have a few minutes while they're setting up for lunch. So if there are additional questions, anybody should feel free to jump in.
Hi, I have a comment on the last question, and I'm not on the panel, so you didn't ask me, Kyle. But I am on the Equos team, and I think that I've heard a lot about disaggregation and how are we comparing credentials that are for different purposes, right? Like somebody with an MBA who gets an IT credential is not the same as somebody who has some college, no degree, and is trying to learn how to code or is getting a healthcare credential. Those are really different situations. And to Jeff's point, while a lot of people already have a degree and are supplementing with more specific and technical, I think the point of looking at non-degree credentials for workers who don't have degrees is to understand how can we lift those workers up? Is it the full potential of our, production possibility frontier? Probably not. But unless somebody has a lot of money to get everybody a PhD, then we're probably not going to get to the maximum there anyways. So, and then thinking about sort of the different groupings, there are a lot of credentials, and I know the number 1 million gets thrown around, but in our data set of 19 million, I can tell you that we are seeing again, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of credentials. And coming to this point of when do we feel confident about saying this is providing enough information that is high quality that we can actually make decisions on it. And one of the things that we've done is say, okay, well, how can we look at if we don't have enough observations for a particular credential, how are we bucketing that with something that's similar and saying, these are credentials in Tableau, these are the skills you're going to learn, and here are the names of those credentials. And on average, this is what you might expect for a credential that offers Tableau mapping skills. And it's a lot of information. When I think, when are we going to see this information really make a change? And I think that the system change is probably actually easier than the individual change, because right now we are in data overload, and the fact that most people get their news and education advice from their phones and TikTok and Instagram. I think that the people in this room and rooms like this we're going to have a really hard time penetrating that sort of marketing campaign.
Yeah, just a quick reaction. I was not into trying to say that everybody should get a PhD. I was talking about research that looks at the complementarity of how technical and specific education can work together, and I think that can happen at all levels. But I do want to take one issue with something that you might have been saying, maybe not purposely, about, well, that's just good enough. Tracking has resulted because we said that's just good enough, and that commonly was said that's just good enough for that group. And that created a two-tier system with clearly differential outcomes, terminal education versus continuance, and big differences in earnings. And so that statement, and I run this all the time, it's like, if we have a program that raises somebody out of poverty, isn't that just good enough? But then we ask who we're applying it to, and it usually is first generation, people of color, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not for the white male going onto a BA where we've seen the biggest growth. I mean, so we have got to ask ourselves how the system architecture is partially responsible for massive inequities in our system. Now, I'm not saying that you're positive, but that's a struggle, and like, I don't know what to do with it, because I run into this myself in my work. So it's a great question, but I don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And in some qualitative work that I've done with work, it's people are, it's just everyone has such a different situation. And I love your point. Like, it's not good enough, right? Like, lifting somebody just out of poverty should not be our line of like, yay, we've done it. We can all retire and live happy now. But I think that for so many workers, stability, so not necessarily it's like, oh, I'm being lifted out of poverty, but like, I just know that I'm going to be able to feed my kids and I'm going to be able to house my kids. That for them is good enough. And I know we brought up ECE, early childhood education earlier, and I think about like, what are the really long-term impacts that these investments can make? And while these parents who are maybe earning non-degree credentials or going back to work, they might feel like this is good enough. Where can we imagine that their kids are going to be? It's been a long time since I've been in school and reading real heavy research papers, but knowing that like kids usually out earn their moms based on their mom's education level, right? So how can we make sure that that sort of continues, and not just at the degree level and at the high school level, but for workers who don't have the opportunity to spend so much time on their education because of their constraints in life because of the system.
Well, there's clearly a lot of directions we can go in on this conversation. I was actually to be honest, I was worried at one point when we were putting this program together. Like, we had two panels back to back that kind of both touched on credential quality. Will we, run out of things to say? We've barely touched the surface on talking about different pros and cons of different data sources, lots of other different directions we could go in. but I did get the thumbs up from the caterer saying, and now he's nodding, now's the time. I don't want to stand in the way. So I think maybe just I'll close with just a quick programming note. We got an hour for lunch now. One thing that was not mentioned in the strategic planning discussion, but something people said overwhelmingly was that they appreciated having time to network at these meetings. So we definitely do not want to encroach on that. So we have an hour for lunch. After we come back, we'll have another remote presentation coming in. Hans Shapiro from the Danish Technological Institute will talk about developments on the other side of the pond, about transatlantic and international developments on micro-credentialing, and then we'll have another, and then we'll go into a series of presentations this afternoon. We do have time in that open forum still that we'll try to stretch things out as much as we can to fit in as many micro presentations from those of you who have RSVP'd already for that. Everybody will have hopefully 3 to 4 minutes, and then we'll have the policy panel to close out the day, and we'll close out the day with a few final remarks. Definitely keep reflecting on what we discussed in the morning, not just about the last couple of panels, but also the morning discussion about how are these meetings helpful? What can we do to improve and continue this sustainability of the NCRN? Look around that. This work will have a today. The weather forecast, it does look like the rain is done for today. There's some hope. It might be dry enough outside. You can go ahead and bring this on the patio around 4:30 p.m. So without further ado, lunch is served. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.